They said I didn't belong in his world. The help, they called me. But when the richest man in town looked at me, he didn't see my skin color. He saw my soul. Our love story shattered a dynasty and changed both our lives forever. If you've ever felt out of place, judged for who you are rather than what you bring to the table, hit that subscribe button. This is a story about breaking barriers, finding love in unexpected places, and standing firm when the world tries to tear you down. I grew up in East Side where the buildings wore their age like badges of honor. My mama worked double shifts at the hospital while my father drove city buses. We weren't poor. My parents made sure I never felt that. But we were always one broken appliance away from trouble. Our neighborhood was a tapestry of lives, everyone looking out for each other because we had to. The smell of Miss Jackson's sweet potato pies would float through our apartment complex every Sunday, and Mr. Reynolds' saxophone would serenade us on warm summer evenings. We didn't have much, but we had community. College wasn't a given for kids like me, but I fought my way through with scholarships and night jobs. My business degree felt like a golden ticket, my passport to somewhere different. I didn't want to escape my roots. I just wanted to prove that someone from Eastside could make it anywhere. When the job posting for an executive assistant at Blackwell Industries appeared in my inbox, something told me to take the chance. The interview process was intimidating. 5 rounds of scrutiny, each room filled with people who looked nothing like me. I wore my mother's pearl earrings for luck and spoke with a confidence I wasn't sure I owned yet. I'll never forget the first time I walked into Alexander Blackwell's office. The elevator had climbed 50 floors, each ding marking my ascent into a world I'd only seen in magazines. His office overlooked the entire city, my neighborhood just a cluster of distant rooftops from that height. Alexander himself was nothing like I expected. Tall, imposing, but with eyes that actually looked at you when you spoke. Not through you, like most of the executives I'd met. "Welcome to Blackwell Industries, Maya," he said, using my name like it mattered. But that moment of warmth quickly dissolved into the cold reality of corporate America. The invisible barriers went up immediately. Lunches where I was the only one not invited. Conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Diane from marketing asking if I could grab her a coffee during a meeting I was supposed to present at. The security guard who always checked my badge, even after 6 months. The way some clients would look surprised when Alexander introduced me as his executive assistant instead of the help. I started wearing my hair straight instead of natural, switched my gold hoops for simple studs, and practiced making my voice sound professional. Code for less like where you come from. Alexander and I maintained a strictly professional relationship at first. Our interactions were limited to meeting preparations, calendar management, and coordinated business trips I would arrange but never attend. He was polite, respectful, but distant, the proper distance between an executive and his assistant. Yet sometimes when I'd bring him research for an upcoming presentation, I'd catch him looking at my notes with genuine interest, asking questions about my perspective, not just the facts I'd gathered. The cultural gap between us was a silent character in every interaction. He casually mentioned his summers in the Hamptons. I remembered summers at the community pool. He ordered lunch without looking at prices. I calculated every expense in my head. He belonged to clubs I couldn't pronounce correctly. I belonged to a world he had never set foot in. We moved through the same physical space but inhabited different universes. Yet despite these differences, small moments of connection flickered between us. Like when he overheard me on the phone with my mom discussing her arthritis treatment. The next day, he casually mentioned a specialist his own mother had seen. Or when the office celebrated his birthday with an extravagant surprise, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention, catching my eye across the room with a look that said, "Can you believe this?" In those moments, I glimpsed something familiar in him, something that didn't quite fit in his world either. Everything changed with the Westfield project. Our company was competing for a contract that would transform the downtown area. New apartments, shops, offices, the works. Alexander needed someone who understood the community impact, not just the profit margins. And somehow, that person was me. "Maya, I want you to lead the community research team," he said one Tuesday morning, so casually it took me a moment to realize what he was asking. Not fetching coffee or taking notes, actually leading. The project meant late nights at the office. Just Alexander and me surrounded by takeout containers and spreadsheets. The formal walls between us began to crumble in those midnight hours. There's something about the quiet of an empty office, the city lights twinkling below, that makes people more honest. We'd remove our metaphorical masks, his tie loosened, my professional smile relaxed. I learned he hated classical music despite his season tickets to the symphony. He discovered I could recite poetry from memory, something my grandmother had taught me. Why Blackwell Industries? He asked me one night, genuinely curious about why I'd chosen his company. I told him the truth, that I wanted to work somewhere I could make real change, not just a paycheck. He nodded slowly, then admitted, "Sometimes I wonder if we're actually making any difference at all." The first time he stood up for me is etched in my memory like a photograph. We were presenting our community engagement plan to the board. Old money, old ideas, old prejudices. One board member, Mr. Harrington, kept directing all his questions to Alexander, even though I was the one presenting. Then came the comment, "Interesting choice having someone like her lead community outreach. I suppose it has a certain optics advantage." The room went quiet. I'd heard worse, prepared my practice smile, ready to push through. But Alexander's voice cut through the silence. "Maya isn't leading this project because of optics, Richard. She's leading it because she's the most qualified person in this building to understand what communities actually need, not what we think they need." He stood up, towering over the table. "If you can't recognize talent without filtering it through your prejudice, perhaps Blackwell Industries isn't the right investment for you." I nearly dropped my presentation notes. No one had ever risked anything to defend me before. The meeting continued, but something fundamental had shifted between us. Later in the elevator, I tried to thank him. He just shook his head and said, "Don't thank me for doing the bare minimum of human decency, Maya." As the weeks passed, I began noticing the values we actually shared beneath our different exteriors. His belief that business should serve communities, not exploit them. His quiet donations to education programs. My passion for creating economic opportunities in neighborhoods like mine. Our shared love of solving problems others deemed impossible. We were like two books with different covers, but surprisingly similar stories inside. The walls between personal and professional began to blur. Our conversations would drift from market analyses to favorite books, childhood memories, hopes for the future. He asked about my family with genuine interest. I found myself curious about the man behind the corporate empire. "Did you always want this life?" I asked him once. The sadness that flickered across his face told me more than his carefully measured response about family expectations and legacy. There was a night when everything changed, subtle but seismic. We'd won the Westfield contract after months of work. The office celebrated with champagne and catered food. But as the party wound down, Alexander asked if I wanted to get some real food. "There's this place in Eastside," and I suggested, immediately regretting it. What was I thinking? Inviting Alexander Blackwell to a hole-in-the-wall restaurant in my neighborhood? But his eyes lit up. "I'd love that," he said, and he meant it. Watching him sit in Ms. Rosie's diner, his expensive suit out of place against the vinyl seats, eating the best fried catfish in the city with his fingers, because I told him that's how it's done. Something shifted between us. He wasn't a billionaire that night, and I wasn't his assistant. We were just two people sharing a meal, laughing too loud, talking too much. When he dropped me at my apartment, there was a moment, just a heartbeat, where we both seemed to realize simultaneously that whatever was growing between us had already crossed every professional boundary there was. 3 weeks after our dinner at Ms. Rosie's, Alexander asked me to stay behind after a meeting. My mind immediately went through all possible scenarios. Was I being fired? Had I crossed a line? Was the Westfield project in trouble? Instead, he stood by his floor-to-ceiling windows, hands in his pockets, suddenly looking less like the confident CEO and more like a nervous teenager. "Would you have dinner with me, Maya?" he asked, then quickly added, "Not as my assistant, not for work, just us." The question hung in the air between us like a fragile thing. I remember thinking about all the reasons I should say no. Office relationships were complicated enough without adding the power dynamics, the racial differences, the class divide. I'd worked too hard to be seen as a professional to risk it all for what exactly? I can't, I told him, watching his face fall. You're my boss, Alexander. There are 100 reasons why this is a bad idea. What I didn't say was that I'd already imagined those same dinner dates 100 times in my head. What if I wasn't your boss? He asked. What if we were just two people who met somewhere else? I almost laughed. But we didn't. And we aren't. 2 days later, a transfer request appeared on my desk. He was moving me to head community relations, reporting to the VP of operations, not to him. Along with it was a note. Now I'm not your boss. Dinner? God help me, I said yes. We began meeting at places where we wouldn't be recognized. Small restaurants in neighboring towns, hidden coffee shops, art galleries in up-and-coming districts. Each date felt like stepping into a bubble where the outside world couldn't touch us. We discovered each other slowly, carefully, like unwrapping something precious. I learned about his childhood spent trying to please an impossible father. He listened to stories about my grandmother's wisdom and my dreams of starting community development programs. But reality always found us eventually. The first sign of trouble came when his sister Charlotte spotted us at a jazz club 2 cities over. The look she gave me wasn't anger or disgust. It was pity, as if she knew something I didn't about how this story would end. The next day, his family's foundation suddenly wanted more documentation on the community programs I was developing. Coincidence, Alexander assured me. I knew better. My own fears kept me awake at night. Was I just an exotic adventure for him? Would my career survive if this ended badly? What would my parents think about me dating a man whose family had probably benefited from the same systems that had kept families like mine, working twice as hard for half as much? My friend Tasha didn't mince words. Girl, you're playing with fire. Men like him don't marry women like us. Her words stung because part of me feared she was right. Then came the charity gala. Alexander was being honored for his philanthropic work, and to everyone's shock, he asked me to accompany him, not as an employee, but as his date. Walking into that ballroom on his arm felt like crossing a threshold we couldn't return from. The whispers were immediate, the stares unsubtle. I wore a dress I couldn't afford and tried to remember which fork to use first. That's Edgar Blackwell's son with his assistant, I overheard one woman stage whisper to another. Clearly a phase. His mother must be having fits. Alexander seemed oblivious to it all, proudly introducing me to everyone as Maya Taylor, the brilliant mind behind our community initiatives. But I felt every sideways glance, every conversation that stopped when we approached. I excused myself to the bathroom and texted Tasha, "You were right. I don't belong here." Her response came instantly. Maybe, but does he belong where he is? The society pages didn't hold back the next day. Blackwell heir brings assistant to charity gala was one of the kinder headlines. Others speculated about my agenda or his rebellious phase. One particularly nasty column suggested I was strategically climbing the corporate ladder horizontally. I placed the newspaper on his desk without a word. He read it, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. Then he did something I'll never forget. He tore it in half, dropped it in the trash, and said, "I've never been more proud to have someone by my side, Maya. Their opinions matter about as much as yesterday's weather forecast." That night, sitting on my small balcony overlooking the neighborhood where I grew up, Alexander told me he loved me for the first time. And despite every reason to guard my heart, I believed him. Meeting the Blackwell family wasn't an event, it was a reckoning. Alexander insisted on bringing me to their monthly family dinner at the estate, a sprawling mansion that had been in their family for generations. I spent hours choosing the right outfit, practicing what to say, as if the perfect combination of words and wardrobe could somehow make them see past the color of my skin and the neighborhood on my resume. The mansion was exactly what you'd imagine: sweeping staircases, paintings of stern-faced ancestors, furniture too pristine to actually sit on. Mrs. Blackwell greeted me with a practiced society smile that never reached her eyes. So lovely to finally meet Alexander's friend, she said, the pause before friend lasting just long enough to make her meaning clear. Edgar Blackwell, Alexander's father, didn't bother with such subtleties. He barely acknowledged my presence, speaking around me rather than to me. When I mentioned my work in community relations, he nodded vaguely and changed the subject to a golf game. Alexander's sister Charlotte was civil but distant, studying me like I was a problem she needed to solve. The dinner conversation flowed around topics designed to exclude: boarding schools I hadn't attended, people I'd never met, traditions I didn't understand. I felt like a fish flopping on dry land, gasping for familiar waters. Alexander tried to include me, explain inside jokes, steer topics toward neutral ground, but even he couldn't bridge a divide that had been carefully constructed over generations. When dessert was served, Edgar asked Alexander to join him in his study. They were gone nearly an hour. I sat with the Blackwell women in uncomfortable silence, answering polite questions about the weather while wondering what was happening behind that closed door. Alexander emerged looking like he'd aged 10 years. On the drive home, he gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They gave me an ultimatum," he finally said, his voice hollow. "End things with you, or lose my position as heir to Blackwell Industries. My trust fund, my seat on the board, all of it." I felt sick. "Alexander, that's your entire life, your family legacy. Is that really what you think of me?" he interrupted, hurt flashing in his eyes. "That I'd choose money over you? That legacy matters more than love." But it wasn't just family trouble brewing. The business fallout came quickly. Two major investors suddenly developed concerns about the company's direction. A board member questioned whether our community focus was detracting from shareholder value. Alexander's judgment was subtly but persistently called into question in meetings. No one ever mentioned me directly. They didn't have to. My own community's reaction was complicated. Some friends were happy for me, but others looked at me differently. "Getting too good for us now?" my cousin joked. But there was an edge to it. When Alexander came to my neighborhood, I could feel the stares, hear the whispers. Some people thought I was selling out, others that I was being used. My mother worried endlessly, not because she didn't like Alexander, but because she'd seen too many people get hurt crossing invisible lines society had drawn. "Are you sure about this road you're taking, baby?" she asked me one Sunday after church. "It's not an easy one." "I'm not sure about anything, Mama," I admitted, "except how I feel when I'm with him." She squeezed my hand. "Then that'll have to be enough for now." The breaking point came at the annual shareholders meeting. Alexander had prepared to announce a major expansion of our community development initiatives, projects we'd worked on together, that would create jobs and opportunities in underserved areas. But minutes before the presentation, his father took him aside. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw Alexander's face change, hardening into something I'd never seen before. When he took the stage, he abandoned his prepared remarks. Instead, he spoke from the heart about what Blackwell Industries could be. Not just profitable, but purposeful. Not just wealthy, but worthy. "Some of you have questioned my judgment lately," he said, his eyes finding his father in the crowd. "You've wondered if I've been distracted. Let me be clear. I've never seen more clearly in my life." Then, to everyone's shock, he called me to the stage. I walked up on shaking legs, aware of every eye in the room. "This is Maya Taylor," he said, taking my hand. "She's taught me more about leadership and integrity in 1 year than I've learned in a lifetime of boardrooms. If loving her cost me my place in this company, it's a price I'm willing to pay." The room erupted into chaos. His father stormed out. Board members huddled in urgent whispers, and Alexander led me through the crowd, head high, not looking back. That night, his access cards were deactivated. His company email shut down. The dynasty had made its choice, and so had Alexander. The morning after the shareholders' meeting, Alexander and I sat at my small kitchen table, drinking coffee from chipped mugs, facing a future neither of us had planned for. His family fortune was gone. His career at Blackwell Industries was over. The golden path that had been laid out for him since birth had disappeared overnight. "Do you regret it?" I asked him, terrified of the answer. He looked around my modest apartment, so different from the penthouse he'd given up, and smiled. "I regret that it took me so long to find what actually matters. We started over with nothing but our skills, our determination, and each other." Well, not exactly nothing. Alexander still had his education, his connections outside his family, and a small personal savings his father couldn't touch. I had my community relationships, my business degree, and intimate knowledge of what neighborhoods like mine actually needed to thrive. Together, we had something powerful, a vision. We founded Taylor Blackwell Community Development, working from a tiny office above Miss Rosie's diner. Our mission was simple but ambitious. Create economic opportunities in underserved communities through small business loans, educational programs, and affordable housing development. We started small with one project in my old neighborhood, renovating an abandoned building into affordable apartments with ground floor retail spaces for local entrepreneurs. The first year was brutal. We worked 18-hour days, fought for every permit, every dollar of funding. Alexander learned what it meant to operate without the Blackwell name opening doors. I learned what it meant to be taken seriously as a business leader rather than an assistant. We argued, we compromised, we grew. And slowly, project by project, our vision took shape. Not everyone abandoned Alexander. His college roommate invested in our first development. His mother's sister, the black sheep of the family who'd married beneath her station decades ago, became an unexpected ally and investor. My community, initially skeptical, began to see that our work wasn't charity. It was partnership. Ms. Jackson, who'd baked those sweet potato pies of my childhood, opened a bakery in our first retail space. Mr. Reynolds' grandson started a music school in another. Success for us wasn't measured in dollars, though those eventually came. It was measured in graduation rates rising in neighborhoods where we worked, in small businesses thriving where boarded-up storefronts once stood, in families building generational wealth through home ownership programs we created. Time has a way of softening even the hardest edges. 3 years into our venture, Charlotte, Alexander's sister, showed up at our office unannounced. "Father doesn't know I'm here," she said awkwardly, "but I've been watching what you're building. It's impressive." It was the smallest of olive branches, but we took it. Slowly, certain family members began to come around. Never his father, but others who saw the impact of our work and the happiness Alexander had found. We got married on a Sunday afternoon in the community garden we'd helped establish in my old neighborhood. No society pages covered it, no luxury brands sponsored it. My mother made her famous peach cobbler. Alexander's aunt brought flowers from her garden. Our wedding party was made up of colleagues who'd become family and neighbors who'd become friends. As the sun set over the city skyline, casting golden light over the place where my roots ran deep, I realized we'd created something neither of us could have built alone, a bridge between worlds. The real legacy of our story isn't just about us. It's about the young people who work for us now. Kids from my neighborhood who see Alexander and me side by side and realize that barriers can be broken. It's about the executive mentorship program we started, pairing corporate leaders with promising students from underserved schools. It's about the foundations that now fund our work, recognizing that diversity isn't just the right thing to do, it's smart business. Last month, Edgar Blackwell had a stroke. Alexander visits him in the hospital every day, though his father still barely acknowledges him. There's no Hollywood reconciliation there, no dramatic forgiveness scene. Some bridges take longer to build, but Alexander goes anyway, because that's who he is. A man who chooses love, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. People often ask if our story's a fairy tale. It's not. Fairy tales end when the prince chooses the commoner. Our story began there. The choice to love across boundaries isn't a single moment of courage. It's 1,000 daily decisions to keep choosing each other when the world tells you not to. It's finding the strength to build something new when old structures fail you. I was just a black woman in his world until we created a world of our own. And in that world, we're writing a legacy that has nothing to do with last names or bank accounts, and everything to do with the lives we touch along the way. Our journey wasn't easy, but nothing worth having ever is. If our story touched you, please like and share it with someone who needs to hear that love can triumph over prejudice. Leave a comment about your own experience breaking barriers, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that might just give you the courage to follow your heart no matter what the world says.